This is a scene that could be misunderstood. A man is holding two girls covered in blood, gently stroking their heads. The girl's father, seeing this, viciously punches the man several times. The policeman put a gun to his chin and spat at him with great disgust, believing the man is guilty. In reality, the man is trying to save the two children. Soon, the man is convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Despite his efforts to save the girls, this is a must-watch film about redemption in life. Since its release in 1999, it has garnered an impressive 8.9 rating from 300,000 viewers and is considered a standout in prison-themed movies. The man's name is John Coffey. Before the incident, no one had ever seen him before. When he first arrived at the prison, a guard named Percy Wetmore arrogantly shouted that the death row inmate had arrived. The warden, Paul Edgecomb, was extremely nervous and quickly intervened. John Coffey, a giant of a man, twice the size of an average person, and whose every step seemed to shake the ground, appeared deeply troubled. His eyes were filled with innocence and clarity. Paul Edgecomb couldn't help but ask if there was a problem. John Coffey replied, "Can the lights be left on at night when I sleep? I'm afraid of the dark, especially in a strange place." John Coffey seemed like a simple-minded child, far from being vicious. This intrigued Paul Edgecomb, who then decided to look into John Coffey's background. He discovered that John Coffey was accused of killing two young girls. When the girls' father and the police arrived, they found John Coffey holding the girls' bodies, wailing and crying. He murmured, "I tried to save them, but I did my best." Paul Edgecomb found it hard to believe. John Coffey seemed more like a gentle giant than a cold-blooded killer. But the case was closed, and thinking about it further seemed futile. The next day, the guards received a notice to pick up a prisoner from the hospital. This prisoner appeared to be mentally challenged, constantly drooling, and unresponsive to calls. The guards had to dress him and bring him back to the prison. To their surprise, as soon as they opened the cell door, the prisoner smirked and launched an attack on the guards. Seeing a guard being strangled by handcuffs, Paul Edgecomb rushed to help, only to be kicked in the groin by Wild Bill Wharton. Fortunately, another guard arrived in time to attack Wild Bill Wharton from behind and subdue him. As the crowd dispersed, Paul Edgecomb, unable to bear it any longer, collapsed to the ground. Over the years, he had been plagued by illness. During the day, he had to endure excruciating pain just to use the restroom, straining for a long time to barely urinate. At night, he would often be awakened by pain, having to desperately rush to the bathroom, clenching his legs tightly together. Sometimes, Paul Edgecomb would be in so much pain that he would collapse and have to relieve himself right there. The recent blow had nearly taken half of Paul Edgecomb's life. Pain spread throughout his body, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. At that moment, John Coffey unexpectedly begged Paul Edgecomb to see him. Out of respect for the prisoner, Paul Edgecomb struggled to get up. However, just as he was about to ask John Coffey what he wanted, the light bulb in the prison began to brighten. John Coffey let go, and Paul Edgecomb suddenly felt as if the pain had disappeared. He looked at John Coffey in astonishment, only to see John Coffey in great discomfort. He began to cough violently, and suddenly, thousands of black bugs flew out of his mouth, disappearing into the air. Paul Edgecomb stared in disbelief at the scene before him. He couldn't help but ask John Coffey what he had done. John Coffey wearily replied, "I cured your disease." Paul Edgecomb, feeling unbelievable relief, went to the bathroom. It was such a relief. It turns out that using the restroom could also be a pleasure. The divine power of John Coffey made Paul Edgecomb respect him even more. Could such a person really be a murderer? The next day, Paul Edgecomb found John Coffey's defense attorney. The lawyer said John Coffey was like a man who had dropped from the sky. No one knew his past, and he had no criminal record. To repay John Coffey, Paul Edgecomb brought him bread made by his wife. The kind-hearted John Coffey shared the bread with Edouard Delacroix, who was imprisoned across from him. This angered Wild Bill Wharton, who cursed at John Coffey. Paul Edgecomb stepped in to stop him, but Wild Bill Wharton spat directly at him. Paul Edgecomb never counts, but Wild Bill Wharton grows more and more arrogant, trying to humiliate the guards every time he checks on them. One day, as Percy Wetmore walked by, Wild Bill Wharton grabbed him and kissed his face, uttering obscenities. Percy Wetmore struggled in fear, and when Wild Bill Wharton let go, his pants were already half wet. On ordinary days, Percy Wetmore was always arrogant and domineering, bullying the prisoners in various ways. Now, seeing Percy Wetmore in such a sorry state, Edouard Delacroix couldn't help but burst into laughter. This was simply a great humiliation. With hatred in his heart, Percy Wetmore glared viciously at Edouard Delacroix, secretly vowing to make Edouard Delacroix's life a living hell one day. Edouard Delacroix had a small, tame mouse that could perform various tricks. They were inseparable, sharing food and sleep. The mouse was his family, his spiritual solace. One day, the mouse ran out of the cell, and Percy Wetmore saw an opportunity. He extended his foot and deliberately, accurately stepped on it. Edouard Delacroix screamed in sorrow, Heartbroken, everyone present was shocked. Everyone understood the significance of the mouse to Edouard Delacroix, except for Percy Wetmore, who casually walked away as if nothing had happened. As everyone lamented the fate of the mouse, a large black hand reached out. It was John Coffey. He instructed Paul Edgecomb to quickly hand the mouse to him. Perhaps there was still hope. Amidst the bewildered gazes of everyone present, John Coffey cupped the mouse in his hands, gently kissed it, and with a burst of light, the mouse's tail twitched. A few seconds later, John Coffey opened his mouth in pain, and countless tiny black bugs flew out of his mouth, slowly disappearing into the air. The mouse appeared unharmed before everyone. A miracle had occurred, leaving everyone present stunned, unable to recover from the shock. Resurrected from the dead, it exceeded their understanding. After a long while, Paul Edgecomb, who had come to his senses, along with the guards, found Percy Wetmore and threatened him to leave the prison. Such a malicious person didn't deserve to stay here. Percy Wetmore, however, said that he had come to the prison so that he could carry out an execution himself, and in order to get him out as quickly as possible, Paul Edgecomb agreed to. A few days later, Paul Edgecomb went to Edouard Delacroix's cell. Today was the day of Edouard Delacroix's execution, and what he couldn't let go of the most was the little mouse. To ease Edouard Delacroix's mind, Paul Edgecomb told him about a nearby mouse village, a famous tourist destination, where mice not only had food and drink but also performed various tricks. Edouard Delacroix smiled happily after hearing this. He could finally leave without any worries. As the execution approached, Edouard Delacroix suddenly became uncontrollably sad. He said, "Don't forget about the mouse village." But Percy Wetmore replied, "There is no such place. They made it up to deceive you." With a heart full of malice, Percy Wetmore wanted Edouard Delacroix to die with regret. Seeing Edouard Delacroix's face filled with sadness and pain, Percy Wetmore happily had a hood placed over his head. Before an execution, a sponge needs to be wetted and placed on the prisoner's head to ensure that the electric current quickly passes through the body, shortening the execution time and significantly reducing the prisoner's pain. But Percy Wetmore didn't do this to retaliate against Edouard Delacroix. He pretended to wet the sponge and placed it on Edouard Delacroix's head. As the switch was flipped, Edouard Delacroix's agonizing screams echoed through the prison. The smoke billowed violently from his head, making Paul Edgecomb realize that the sponge had been tampered with. If he pulled down the switch now, it would only make Edouard Delacroix suffer unbearably. He could only stand helplessly aside, watching as Edouard Delacroix's body was slowly burned, enduring extreme pain. Soon, the smell of burning flesh filled the air, and people had never seen such a cruel scene, frightening them into fleeing. At this moment, John Coffey, who was helping with the mouse, suddenly began to tremble violently, his body soaked in sweat. He had the divine power to sense the pain of those around him, and Edouard Delacroix's pain was now being felt by John Coffey. Trembling, John Coffey accidentally transmitted his divine power to the mouse in his hand. Feeling the pain of its owner, the mouse ran out of the prison as if insane. Seeing Edouard Delacroix burned, Percy Wetmore was indifferent and even pretended not to know the sponge was supposed to be wet. One of the guards could no longer bear it and punched Percy Wetmore in the face. Later, Paul Edgecomb visited the prison to see the little mouse and John Coffey. John Coffey, with a heart full of sorrow, cried, "I'm so tired." Paul Edgecomb understood that the tiredness John Coffey spoke of was not physical but the weariness of having a heart that wanted to save the world yet being powerless to do so. On a day off, Paul Edgecomb visited his friend's house with his wife. Learning that his friend's wife was suffering greatly from brain cancer and had little time left, Paul Edgecomb was deeply saddened. Returning home, he tossed and turned, a bold idea forming in his mind. He wanted John Coffey to use his divine power to save his friend's wife. The next night, Paul Edgecomb gathered his fellow guards and began a plan to escape. In order not to be discovered by outsiders, they first bewitched Wild Bill Wharton and then put Percy Wetmore in the brig in the name of punishment. However, just as they were about to take John Coffey out of the prison, Wild Bill Wharton, still under the influence of drugs, grabbed John Coffey's hand. John Coffey suddenly trembled as if sensing something, but time was running out. Paul Edgecomb pulled Wild Bill Wharton's hand away and led John Coffey out of the prison. Under the starry night sky, John Coffey wore a childlike smile. Taking advantage of the darkness, a group of people arrived at their friend's house, and their friend, awakened by the commotion, cautiously aimed a gun at John Coffey. Ignoring the threat, John Coffey walked straight into the bedroom, his extraordinary powers already sensing the pain of the woman. The woman's face was filled with weariness, and her sunken eyes revealed her deteriorating condition. Seeing John Coffey enter, she became extremely anxious, weakly struggling on the bed. However, as John Coffey sat beside her, the woman's emotions slowly stabilized. John Coffey kissed her, and the light bulbs in the room became unusually bright. While the pendulum clock downstairs stopped ticking, another miracle occurred. The woman instantly regained her vitality, as if she had been reborn. Even the painful memories of her illness dissipated into thin air. Overwhelmed with joy, Their friend wept tears of happiness and embraced his wife tightly. But this healing took a toll on John Coffey. Instead of expelling the dark insects as usual, he collapsed on the ground, coughing uncontrollably. At that moment, the woman noticed John Coffey. She suddenly felt like this person was a part of her life. With tears in her eyes, she took off her necklace and placed it around John Coffey's neck, hoping to bless him with safety. Soon after, the guards dragged the exhausted John Coffey back to the prison. Fearing suspicion, Paul Edgecomb quickly released Percy Wetmore. Percy Wetmore wore a gloomy expression, plotting his revenge. Suddenly, John Coffey grabbed Percy Wetmore's throat, and the guards rushed to intervene. However, John Coffey opened his mouth wide and spat all the small dark insects into Percy Wetmore's mouth. When John Coffey released his grip, Percy Wetmore became vacant, moving forward without any reaction. Wild Bill Wharton, who had just woken up, saw Percy Wetmore walking by and began his usual routine of verbally insulting him. But this time, instead of wetting himself, Percy Wetmore drew his sidearm and started shooting wildly at Wild Bill Wharton. Caught off guard by this sudden action, the guards struggled to intervene. By the time they managed to wrestle the gun away from Percy Wetmore, Wild Bill Wharton was already dead. Pinned down by the guards, Percy Wetmore's stomach churned, and countless dark insects flew out of his mouth. Paul Edgecomb didn't understand why the kind-hearted angel, John Coffey, would do this. John Coffey said, "I punished them. I saw what they did." Without Paul Edgecomb's consent, John Coffey transferred his divine power, the ability to sense the pain of others, to Paul Edgecomb. In an instant, Paul Edgecomb saw the truth of the two little girls' deaths. It turned out that John Coffey was not the killer. The real culprit was Wild Bill Wharton. When John Coffey sensed the girls' pain and arrived at the scene, it was too late. He could only hold the girls helplessly in their pain. Watching this memory, Paul Edgecomb was in tears. John Coffey had a heart full of compassion, enduring the world's cries of pain. He was an angel sent by heaven. But now, the angel was misunderstood by the world. The only comforting thing was that Wild Bill Wharton was shot dead, and Percy Wetmore was sent to a mental hospital due to insanity. The prison returned to its former state. Paul Edgecomb knew that John Coffey was innocent, but the real killer was dead. In a case with no evidence, even if he testified in court, the judge would not believe him. Paul Edgecomb felt deep regret but was powerless to change the situation. So, he came to the prison to release John Coffey, but John Coffey refused. He said, "I'm tired. I need closure. I'm tired of the wandering life. Lonely like a duckweed in the rain. Tired of having no friends around. Tired of hearing and feeling pain every day. And most of all, I'm tired of the ugly face of humanity." Powerless, Paul Edgecomb could only respect John Coffey's choice and was willing to fulfill all his requests. John Coffey said his only wish was to watch a movie called Heaven. His wish was granted, and as the light from the projector passed over John Coffey's head, he looked at the screen with a long-lost smile, appearing like an angel. Soon, it was John Coffey's execution day. The guards arrived at the cell in full gear, each with a solemn face, but John Coffey was very calm. He smiled and reassured everyone not to worry, as he would soon be released. Entering the execution chamber, John Coffey's mood suddenly became somewhat low. He said, "There are many people here who hate me. I can feel it." The guard said, "Try to feel our feelings. We don't hate you." The guard's love calmed John Coffey's heart once again as he calmly sat on the electric chair. However, the guards were in tears. Paul Edgecomb asked him if there was anything else he wanted to say. John Coffey said, "Please don't put the hood over my head. I'm afraid of the dark. Angels should live in the light." Paul Edgecomb agreed. When it was time to apply the electricity, Paul Edgecomb stood still, unable to give the order. He couldn't bear to destroy God's creation, the angel who had come down to earth. But he was powerless. Paul Edgecomb approached John Coffey and shook his hand in farewell, his eyes full of self-blame and reluctance. At that moment, John Coffey finally obtained the release he desired. From then on, Paul Edgecomb and the other guards left the prison one after another. Many years later, when Paul Edgecomb watched the movie Heaven again in the nursing home, memories flooded back to him like a torrent, and the elderly Paul Edgecomb suddenly burst into tears. He then told this mysterious story to an old friend, who found it hard to believe such a bizarre tale. So, Paul Edgecomb took him to the back mountain where a cabin stood in the woods. Pushing open the door, at Paul Edgecomb's call, a gray-haired old mouse crawled out of a cigar box on the ground. This astonished the old friend, but it was indeed the same mouse from years ago, when John Coffey transferred his divine power to Paul Edgecomb and the mouse. Their lives were extended. Paul Edgecomb saw this as a blessing, allowing him and the mouse to continue the miracles of God. But it was also a punishment, as it was he who had placed John Coffey in the electric chair, extinguishing the miracle of God. So, at the age of 108, he witnessed many wonders in the world but could only watch as his loved ones, children, and friends left him one by one. The term Green Mile refers to the path from the prison to the execution chamber. which was painted green. Green represents vitality and rebirth. John Coffey was like a gift from God to mankind, a symbol of the goodness and love of humanity. He came to the evil prison, sacrificed his health, and used great love to heal others, redeeming their souls, bringing miracles to the Green Mile. But in reality, there are no angels with divine powers in the world, bringing warmth and hope to people. Often, it is ordinary people like John Coffey, without noble birth or distinguished status, who, even if they live namelessly, always carry the faith of kindness and love forward. If you have been touched by their stories, it is the brilliance of humanity, illuminating the lives that seek the light. I am a movie enthusiast. Welcome to subscribe to my channel. See you next time.